Hello and welcome. My name is Mary Crockett Hill, the editor of Roanoke Review, and I am so happy that I can be here today for this conversation with Henry Taylor, who is the co-founder of Roanoke Review, as well as a Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, but the person who got us started in 1967, so we're really happy to be here to have a conversation with him. We're here today with novelist and short story writer Cameron McKenzie, who also is the book reviewer for Roanoke Review, and Olivia Samamy, who is our content editor. She's a student at Roanoke College for a few more months, maybe just 1 month, and then we'll be heading off to graduate school in library science. And so I'm going to leave things up to you. I'm going to kind of fade away and listen in with eager ears.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Mary.
So thank you so much for speaking with us. I think I have the first question, so we're going to start with that. So you founded Roanoke Review in 1967, so over 50 years ago, as a place for other poets to share their work. Do you feel that this experience influenced your own writing career?
Well, I don't know that it had a very strong direct influence. It was something that it just felt really good to be doing. Ed Tedeschi was a student. He was a senior, I think, and he came to my office one day and said that he thought it would be a good idea if Roanoke College had a magazine that looked beyond the bounds of the campus. And I said, well, that sounds like a good idea. How can I help you? And he said, well, I need a faculty advisor for one thing. I said, okay, I'm on. And we had a little discussion about what to call the magazine. I can't remember now some of his ideas about that, but he wanted to be out a little bit on the edge. And I thought it was something a little more traditional would be better. And so in my role as faculty advisor, I strongly advised him that we call it the Roanoke Review. And we beat the bushes among my friends and acquaintances for the first issue. We had some really distinguished people in that first issue, Malcolm Cowley, for example. And so we were off and running.
Great, thank you so much for your answer and for founding it. It's still a joy to work with. So I'll turn it over to Cameron for the next question.
Sure.
Yeah, sure. Again, it's great to get the chance to talk to you, especially about this really remarkable collection that is just out. I know we're excited to talk to you about not only your work, but your process and just maybe even some general thoughts
Sure.
about poetry. And I hope we could start, if you could read us the poem Silo. And this is one of the newer ones. I feel like there are really a handful of poems in this book that just sort of span the decades that are able to just coalesce so many themes at one time. And I feel like Silo is one of them. So if you could read that for us to start us off.
Be glad to, thank you. Silo. From dinner with my sisters at the farm, I walked out through the backyard just at dusk, down toward the dairy, to what we had called the new silo for more than 40 years, it being the only concrete silo on the place. They laid the jointed blocks to 45 feet, a thin steel ladder bolted to the side, a crow's nest at the top. You entered it by lifting the net steel platform like a trapdoor, climbing through, settling it back into its frame, then standing on it. When I was about 12, that was one of the places I needed to be. From up there, I could watch how the barnyard fitted between the barn's end and the shop. Now, against the sky, the big silo loomed, and it came to me to try the climb, to see if I still could. I had taken care enough as a boy, had never slipped, but now I was cautious almost to a fault, speaking aloud each step in the procedure, when I saw that years had opened a gap in the domed roof, and I could see across to the other side where, on the concrete ledge, a slim barn owl stared without blinking from its heart-shaped head. It made a quick, short lean in my direction, combining a greeting and a closer look, dropped from the ledge into the dark, then rose toward me, wings snapped shut for the exit hole, pulled a swift breeze across the top of my head as mind and reflex argued with each other whether to hold on or let go, and soared into a darkling absence that abides.
Right. This poem, I feel like so many others in the last volume, and really sort of throughout the poems in this book, dwells on absence. Right, that last line, the darkling absence that abides. Is this the same absence in your mind that we see in, say, the living room in Springdale with the shadowy non-space, or the hollowed shoe tree and the final morbidity of the interior embezzler? What's this relationship to absence, of things not there, of things gone?
Well, in fact, the last word of the poem is abides, and the absences are paradoxically not entirely absences. They're visitable. You can get to them almost. You can get to them enough to sort of imaginatively inhabit them again, and there's consolation in that. The book Crooked Run, which was the immediate predecessor to this one, is essentially a chronicle of a piece of land that has very gradually being gobbled up by the expansion of the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And so in some ways that's going to be gone for good. But it's not a cause for grief exactly. It's just the things that slip away from us need to be recalled. It's what history is about. The hollowed shoe tree on the, I would just mention, that's just that's not really an absence. That's just a smuggler's trick,
Is that yeah, that's in the final morbidity of the interior embezzler, right? As long with the
right.
Yeah.
I was made extremely happy one day. I got hold of the Library of America collection of Wallace Stevens. And as far as I know, it's the first collection of Wallace Stevens to include any of his writings about business and insurance and stuff like that. I mean, he was vice president of the Hartford Insurance Company. So he wrote tons of stuff for their house organ and whatnot. And nobody had ever picked up on it, except maybe in volumes of letters. So here was this little essay about fidelity and surety claims. When people make claims on their insurance because somebody has stolen a bunch of their money. And he actually said that wonderful thing about embezzlers. And,
that's great. Yeah, I see definitely, you have a relationship with Stevens, with Eliot, I believe William James in here. Who else were you pulling from?
Well, my earliest influences on me were probably in many ways the strongest for a long time. There was a brief period when I was an undergraduate when I thought that James Dickey's way of writing poems was the only way that was worthwhile. And he was very kind about that and tried to explain to me that I probably had my own voice somewhere and that I ought to be bearing down on finding it. But my first book was called Dickey Haunted by some reviewer, and he was quite right. I didn't keep any of those poems when I brought 3 or 4 poems from that first book into this collection. I left the Dickey ones behind, but I remain indebted to him for showing me how to do a certain number of things. George Garrett was another powerful influence, partly as a writer and also as a teacher. He came to the University of Virginia in the fall of my 3rd year there, and became a close friend until his death about a dozen years ago.
What you say about voice is really fascinating, especially the way that this book is set up from the newest poems to the oldest poems. And so we, travel back and see, at least to my mind, how the voice changes, or how the voice sort of
Right.
evolves. Could you
Huh.
read, I believe it's Riding a One-Eyed Horse, which
Uh-huh.
to me feels similar to Silo, or rather the theme seems similar, but the feel is different, or the tone is different.
Yeah, this is a poem that whose surface topic haunted me for years. I was a teenager when I first saw somebody trying to manage a one-eyed horse in a schooling ring that had jumps in it. And the aim of the rider and the people who were around at that moment was to see if the horse could be shown without the judges detecting that he couldn't see out of one of his eyes. His eyes looked normal. Both of them looked fine. So he didn't have a whiteness or a film or anything in the bad eye. He just couldn't see out of it. So the idea was to ride him in such a way that he could see the jumps out of his good eye and not reveal to the judge. It's against the rules to show a horse that's unsound in any way. So they were going to try to pull this off. They decided finally that nobody had the nerve to ride him that straight. That it was too hard to keep from tilting his head a little bit when you started approaching a jump. But anyway, that stayed on my mind for years. And one day, I was sitting in the backyard of a house I lived in McLean, Virginia at that time. I was teaching at American University. And I sat down and I wrote the poem fairly quickly and touched it up over the next few days. Riding a one-eyed horse. One side of his world is always missing. You may give it a casual wave of the hand or rub it with your shoulder as you pass, but nothing on his blind side ever happens. Hundreds of trees slip past him into darkness, drifting into a hollow hemisphere whose sounds you will have to try to explain. Your legs will tell him not to be afraid if you learn never to lie. Do not forget to turn his head and let what comes come seen. He will jump the fences he has to if you swing toward them from the side that he can see and hold his good eye straight. The heavy dark will stay beside you always. Let him learn to lean against it. It will steady him and see you safely through diminished fields.
You said earlier about Silo that it's so important, that last line abides, to that it's not an emptiness, or rather it's an emptiness, it's a presence.
Yeah.
And
Right.
and in such a way it's handleable, or it's livable, or something.
Right.
Is that the same sort of thing that's happening here?
Well, in a way, although I'm not saying here that I feel nostalgic for the days when I rode horses or anything like that. What I'm doing really is saying here, if you find yourself in the position of having to ride a one-eyed horse, there are a few things you ought to remember. And that's essentially the thrust of the poem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there was a period of time, excuse me, when it appeared in various editions of X.J. Kennedy's Introduction to Poetry. They finally dropped it after a while because it got too hard to evade all the online analyses of it. And it was too much work to have to find all those and make sure they weren't in any of the student papers.
Yeah.
But one of the things that Kennedy asked in the first time he printed it was whether the horse stands for something else. And I would be very, very hard pressed to say what it would be.
Yeah. Do you find that sort of analysis interesting, or or more amusing?
I think it's,
as you said, you're simply explaining the thing. Poetic.
I think it's a reasonable approach to a poem to see if there's symbolism in it. And if there's no real reward to the answer, maybe, then you have to back off from it a little bit.
Uh-huh.
I remember many years ago being an undergraduate and sitting in a room listening to Mr. Faulkner answer questions about his work. That's one of the things that he did every year during his period of being writer in residence at the University of Virginia. He would show up at sometime in the spring and he would come up to the podium and he would spend a lot of time putting his fingertips together like this, get them lined up just right and put it down on the podium and look around. And he hadn't yet spoken except to say very quietly, "Thank you," to the professor who introduced him. And he looked around and it came to all of us, as a kind of threat that he had come to answer questions and he was not going to speak till he got one. And often in a situation like that, the silence is broken by somebody who might have a little more nerve than sense. And so you would get something like, Mr. Faulkner, do you have a philosophy of life? Or if so, and if so, what is it? Fear God, women, and the police, he would say. There's finally somebody asked him if Joe Christmas was a Christ figure. Well, it would have been better to say, how are the ways in which you see him as a Christ figure or something like that? But Mr. Faulkner said, I'd have to get that book and read it again before I would understand what you're talking about. You're interested in symbolism, I reckon. I'm not. I'm just interested in telling an interesting and entertaining story dealing with the eternal dilemmas of the human heart. And, that sounds simple enough, but give it a shot sometime. Tell an interesting and entertaining story dealing with the eternal dilemmas of the human heart. Give it a shot.
Yeah.
It's hard.
When you go back through this, say from Silo to One Eye Horse, or to read from the most recent to the earlier poems, it brings up a lot of interesting questions. But do you see differences in theme or technique or voice? Do you see a change in your voice or an evolution in your voice from the earlier to the later work?
I don't see anything radical. I don't see. I see an increasing maybe depth of maturity here and there, but I have not. Many fine poets have come to crossroads at some stage in their career. Somebody like James Wright, for example, who wrote 2 books of poems in rhyme and meter, and then partly under the influence of Robert Bly, started writing free verse. He gradually came back to sometimes to formal traditional form, but it was a real break for him to go from St. Judas to The Branch Will Not Break. I haven't had anything like that happen to me. And I've always felt that it was, there were times when free verse was a good idea, and there are times when rhyme and meter are a good idea. And I think back to, there was a book called Naked Poetry, an anthology that came out in the late 60s, and a second edition sometime in the 70s, which presented a bunch of contemporary poets as if they had never written metrically. Now, some of them hadn't. There was Gary Snyder, for example, maybe was in there, but a few of the poets were very well established formalists, as well as people who had written free verse. Robert Lowell is a very important case in point. And Lowell, they asked people for statements about their attitude toward meter and rhyme and omitting it. And Lowell said, I can't imagine why any poet who can write in either meter or free verse would give up one in favor of the other. And I've always felt that was a kind of sympathetic position. for me.
Yeah, I don't see free verse. The style is very consistent. Maybe I'm sure it's intentionally consistent, but
Yeah.
why not experiment with different sorts of forms, or something much more loose? Why not go further afield, I guess, in
Well, I have experimented with those things, but none of the results have struck me as publishable. I did in my graduate school year, 1965 to 1966, I worked with William J. Smith, primarily a formalist, but he had just published a book called The Tin Can, which is filled with poems in extremely long lines, the kinds of long lines that you have to run under. They're too long to fit the width of the page on one line. And so you indent what the leftovers. And there are poems mostly in an afternoon of pocket billiards that do that. Burning a horse, the smart aleck poem about keeping your lawns up to snuff in the neighborhood. It's called Buildings and Grounds. Those are long line poems that don't rhyme, which is probably about as loose as I've gotten.
Yeah.
I don't feel called to go further in that direction. I've on a few occasions given it a shot, but they don't work for me.
Yeah. Olivia?
Yeah, thanks so much. I was hoping we could get you to read another poem. This one's Creek Walk.
Okay, there are two poems in this book called Creek Walk.
Yes, we're going for the one on page 87, starting with Strolling the Banks.
Oh, okay. I should say maybe that Crooked Run is a real creek that drains a portion of western Loudoun County in northern Virginia. And I grew up along it in 2 or 3 houses. And so I've devoted a whole book to sort of picking up pieces that had washed up on the banks here and there. Strolling the banks of Crooked Run, I round a bend and happen on a skeleton and rippling shreds of bone-white skin in the oxbow pool. It takes but a glance to identify the stark remains of a tall foxhound held in a nearly running posture here at the end of a neighbor's pasture. The open jaws might appear to say we all must find our hard deathbeds, but today I'm out to overrule such hurts as I've been mastered by. The earth's plain speech is all I've found. No agony in the mouth stretched wide, just water rinsing flesh away and bones on their final seaward ride.
Thank you. One thing I really love about this poem is how it takes something that seems like an inordinate occurrence, the skull in the river, and makes it seem so like mundane and focusing on the everyday of the earth's plain speech. So a lot of your poems do tend to focus on everyday occurrences. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about the role of the mundane or everyday in your poetry.
Sure. It's an odd thing. I had that experience it's quite believably. I did take a walk and went down the stream and found this skeleton soaking in the water there. And at that time, I knew that part of my reason for walking around the banks of Crooked Run was to find another poem that I could put in a book that I had already decided was going to be called Crooked Run. And so there, I knew when I saw it that there was going to be something to come of it. Most of the time, when I write a poem that has something to do with an ordinary event. It's an event that I recall, and that in fact I have recalled maybe dozens or hundreds of times before without thinking that it might go into a poem. So there's another ingredient, and I don't know how to define it except to say that there are times when you feel more like writing poems than you do at other times. And how do you bring that feeling about? Well, people have tried all kinds of bizarre experiments to do that. Rimbaud said you had to be drunk all the time, and look what happened to him. But you just never know. Sometime that experience will come into you at the time when you feel like writing, and there it is. How accurately the event ends up reflecting the real event that may have inspired it is a matter of the poet's choice.
Yeah, sounds good. So just a follow-up question, do you, is it a struggle to ever find something new to say about the mundane when you keep writing, poems about, there are lots of similar topics about, the same river?
Yes, there are times when you write something and you get it done and I think to myself, well, this is not so much, this doesn't do the job. So it goes into a pile of discards. And it could happen later on that I could be more fortunate with it. But sometimes the feeling that there's significance here is just misguided. And so it's not, it ends up being a trivial remark about something that happened.
Is that something, is that a choice that you come to through the work?
Yeah.
You sit down, you think it's going to be important.
Oh yeah, yeah. You sit down and I mean, I think that I think it's important to believe while you're writing that what you're writing is good. It's very unproductive to sit there and say to yourself, this is terrible, this is terrible. That's not going to work. So some of the time you may be fooling yourself, but you've got time to cool off and go back and look at it again and find out that yes, indeed, in fact, you were fooling yourself. And the question is, can you rescue it or not? Sometimes you can. So many times you can.
How do you keep the confidence up to sit down and keep doing it if a lot of times it just doesn't work?
Well, I've been at it long enough to know, A, that it has worked several times, and B, that time is short. I'll be 79 in a matter of weeks, and two things happen there. One is that some of your mental processes slow down. Your ability to generate creative energy is somewhat diminished. So you seize the opportunities that come. And I find these days that they don't come all that often. Lately I write a lot more prose than I do verse. I write critical essays, appreciations of this poet or that writer. I do a lot of stuff for a magazine called The Hollands Critic, which comes out about 5 times a year from a little up the road from where you are.
Yeah. When you were younger, how did you, before you had a track record of success, what was it that drove you every day to sit down and try to make the ordinary into?
Well, first of all, I never did. I very rarely spent time writing every day. I can go comfortably for several days or even weeks without writing anything. Because I do think it's important to feel like writing poetry. If you're working on poetry, I don't have to feel all that inspired or anything if I've got to just sit down and willfully crank out another page or two of a critical essay. I've probably got a deadline somewhere down the way. And I've learned that it's a good idea to not to push those too hard. But nobody's out there saying, where's that poem? You know, they're not, that's not happening. So I don't have deadlines for those. But when I was young, I discovered fairly early on that there was something deeply enjoyable about the process itself, no matter how disappointing the final result might become. I learned that at a very early age, that this was fun. I remember a number of years ago, I was still an undergraduate, and I worked at a bookstore up across the University Avenue from the grounds of the university, a place called the Noonday Bookshop. And Erskine Caldwell came to the university and gave a talk one evening in Cabell Hall and answered questions afterwards. And a little old lady asked him in a kind of tremulous voice, what was the part of the writing process that he enjoyed the most? And he said, I don't enjoy any of it, and went on to the next questioner. Well, the next day he came over to the Noonday Bookshop to sign some books that we'd gotten in for the purpose. And at one point there was a little break, and I went over to him and I said, Mr. Caldwell, I believe I caught you in a lie last night. Well, he was, as you might imagine, shocked that an impertinent undergraduate would approach him that way. He said, really? And I said, yes, sir. You told that poor lady that there was no part of the writing process that you enjoyed. And he looked off out the window for a minute. And he said, you're right. That was a lie. I don't really know what came over me. I'm sorry. But I knew, you know, I didn't have a whole lot of experience in those days, but I knew that a person of his gifts didn't have to make a living by agonizing. Purely, I mean, unrelievedly.
That's great. Olivia?
Okay, so hopefully we can move on to another poem. If you wouldn't mind reading Landscape with a Tractor.
All righty. Sorry about that. That wasn't me. Landscape with Tractor. How would it be if you took yourself off to a house set well back from a dirt road, with say 3 acres of grass bounded by road, driveway, and vegetable garden? Spring and summer you would mow the field, not down to lawn, but with a bush hog. Every 6 weeks or so, just often enough to give grass a chance and keep weeds down. And one day, call it August, hot, a storm recently passed, things green and growing a bit, and you're mowing with half your mind on something you'd rather be doing or did once. 3 rounds, and then on the straight alongside the road, maybe 3 swaths in from where you are now, you glimpse it. People will toss all kinds of crap from their cars. It's a clothing store dummy, for God's sake. Another 2 rounds, and you'll have to stop, contend with it, at least pull it off to one side. You keep going. 2 rounds more, then down off the tractor, and Christ, not a dummy, a corpse. The field tilts, whirls, then steadies as you run. Telephone, sirens. 2 local doctors use pitchforks to turn the body some 4 days dead and ripening. And the cause of death, no mystery. 2 bullet holes in the breast of a well-dressed Black woman in perhaps her mid-30s. They wrap her, take her away. You take the rest of the day off. Next day, you go back to the field, having to mow over the damp dent in the tall grass where bluebottle flies are still swirling, but the bush hog disperses them and all traces. Weeks pass. You hear at the post office that no one comes forward to say who she was. Brought out from the city, they guess, and dumped like a bag of beer cans. She was someone, and now is no one, buried or burned or dissected, but gone. And I ask you again, how would it be to go on with your life, putting gas in the tractor, keeping down thistles and seeing each time you pass that spot, the form in the grass, the bright yellow skirt, black shoes, the thing not quite like a face whose gaze blasted past you at nothing when the doctors heaved her over. To wonder from now on what dope deal, betrayal, or innocent refusal brought her here, and to know she will stay in that field till you die.
Thank you. Incredible poem. So I wanted to talk about for this one how we talked about in Creek Walk, you like to focus on the everyday and the mundane, and this is the opposite of that, it's a grotesque occurrence. So what made you depart from your writing about everyday occurrences, and how did it change your writing process?
Well, every now and then, particularly in the poems in The Flying Change, which is where this book first was, where this poem was first collected. There are several poems in that book that take up the not merely the mundane and everyday, but the way that violence has of coming suddenly into the mundane and the everyday and turning it into something else entirely. I can think off the top of my head of 3 or 4 other poems that do that. The longer poem about working up fallen trees for firewood, Taking to the Woods, where suddenly there's that recollection of a guy being killed by a couple of train being coupled. My thought was that this is how life is, that it goes along apparently minding its own business for a while, and all of a sudden there's this thing that happens. And this poem is written in such a way as to try to avoid suggesting that it happened to me, because it didn't. You notice that it's in the second person for most of the way, until it gets to close to the end and the speaker says, "I ask you again." A man that worked for my father had this experience on our property. And it haunted me until I was able to find a way to write about it.
Thank you. I wanted to ask you also about a quote you said in another interview that I think relates to this poem really well. You said, "I think it's too easy to write every now and then a poem too dependent on the intrinsic power of its topic and not dependent enough on the resources of poetry." So I wanted to ask if you felt like this poem, it was a concern of maybe being too dependent on the power of the topic.
I was aware that was a possibility. The same goes for another poem in the same book called Barbed Wire. And matter of fact, I wrote Barbed Wire in response to myself having said that, not on the occasion that you quote, but I had spoken to a group of graduate students at American University about the dangers of relying too heavily on the intrinsic power of the topic, the subject matter, and not enough on the resources of poetry. And so I tried to write Landscape with Tractor in such a way that the language had a certain level of its own power. And I was talking about some of the slightly older poets than I, the confessional poets, Sylvia Plath, Anne Sexton, W.D. Snodgrass, who were trying, not always successfully, to find ways of saying something other than the horse stepped on my daughter's foot and there's blood in her riding boot. I felt that a certain number of the poems by some of those people were too dependent on the shock value of the actual material. And when I said that to the graduate students, I was driving, I said to them, I could tell you a story about something terrible that happened to a horse. And if I put my voice in the right hypnotic frame, as if I were giving a reading or something, you might think you were hearing a real poem, but you might not be. And as I was driving home, I thought about that and said, well, are there things that I could do with that episode to make it have enough linguistic power, enough local richness in the language to support the weight of the event. Sometimes I succeed and sometimes not.
It was very conscious with this poem in particular, that balance between
Oh yeah,
the event and the language.
sure. Anytime you're about to tell a horror story, you want to get your words lined up right.
Mhm.
You know, I've just been thinking a little bit, somewhat shallowly, about H.P. Lovecraft, because I wrote an essay about a guy who reviewed the LOA, the Library of America Lovecraft volume. And one of the things that he points out is that Lovecraft mastered a language which at times is laughable because of its antique qualities, but he does not describe the horrible so much as use language in such a way as to make you get in touch with your own fears and be frightened, because he hasn't told you exactly what it is. When he does tell you exactly what it is, it's not so successful, apparently. I'm not a very frequent reader of Lovecraft myself, and don't intend to be, but I thought that was interesting that this guy Luc Sant pointed that out.
The way that you're able to use language, particularly for me in poems that are dealing with work, with the physical, with action, the way that you write action is so striking and so unique. If you could read Afternoons with a Boomerang on 106, that to me is one that really just sort of encapsulates your ability to write action. I'd love to hear you read it.
Thank you. Afternoons with a Boomerang. An insect afternoon of annoyance, discontent, the vain wish to be far away, and I sit on the patio staring at lawn, woods, receding green patches with the impossible loveliness of vanished children's books. Yet here it is, around me, consoling if not healing. I know no kinder place in which to bear involuntary gloom. Then across the patio comes a blur, red shorts, legs, arms, 3 strides to grass, and I can focus now on Richard coming out from under the weight of his own troubles, his hand cocked, gripping a bright handmade boomerang that now he throws like a knife at a target. For 60 instantaneous feet, it flies straight, then yanks left and banks upward, tilting into level flight, a spun, evanescent circle back to the house, then toward another sweep by the woods, flickering in and out of view against backgrounds of sycamore and maple, sky and grass, a flutter of silence to where he pirouettes, watching the cycle close at the end as the end of the spiral drops within reach and he plucks it from air. Our separate woes may not pass for more than a moment, but this is the moment. Not that he never misses. The stick will spin too hard to be caught, or a stray current of air from the woods grabs an edge, or he has to look into the sun. Sometimes the gravel driveway breaks his stride over the dampening grass. 20 minutes, half an hour, and his arm tires. Still, it always feels like forever. Infinite small variations within the aboriginal pattern, and I think that whatever their use among hunters, artists most deeply own these physical mysteries of getting a skill right, or nearly so, or rarely of getting it wrong. The shout going up at the botched release, the sharp smile of disgust as the boomerang goes off course and snags itself in a tree. Error and correction, flight and return, my son pulling hard as he can toward making a life that is his, lifting himself a little from his private griefs and me for a while out of mine. And though the pain returns, he gives in fading light a look of birthright ease to a difficult thing. whatever unrolls on this spiral path, lifelong though it may be, and hard, is worth no more in the end than these crystal instants of grace and lighthearted awe.
That's great. What's great for me, again, the description of the actual act, which is remarkable, but then you tie it to what artists do. I feel like so much of your poetry explores physicality, especially like perhaps a mind-body connection.
Sure.
And the way I phrase this question, I don't like the way I phrase it, but I'm still going to ask it, because you could say it's neither of these things. Is poetry for you, is this sort of poetry the manifestation of that connection? Or is poetry the explanation of the connection that you've experienced?
I guess manifestation is better. I grew up on a farm, and so I acquired a number of physical skills over the years that there are quite a few folks don't have. I still know how to put hay bales on a wagon so they won't fall off. I'm very grateful that I don't have to do it, but if I had to, I could. I spent years and hours with horses, and got to a level of proficiency with riding and training and showing and competing that was pretty good. And I don't ride anymore either, because I've gotten to an age where falling off would probably be worse for me than I should subject myself to. And falling off is part of the deal. I mean, if you get on, you might not always fall off. You can go for years without falling off, maybe, but sometime you're going to fall off. Just happens. It's part of the deal. And I'm not ready to do that. But for a long time I was. And the mystery of being able to communicate with a horse to the level that you really can without using any words is really something. I mean, it's amazing with the conversations that you can have with a horse using your legs and the balance of your body in the saddle and your hands. You're riding along and you decide to attempt something, and the horse, you can feel the horse saying, is this a good idea, boss? You think I ought to do this? And you can say to him, somewhere along the range between, if you know what's good for you, you will do this, or let's take it easy now and think this thing through. This is really no different from things you've done before. You can do it. And this range between authoritarian dictatorship and kindly encouragement, that's the range in which you operate with the horses day in and day out without using a single word. I mean, you might say whoa sometimes, but essentially they don't use language. And yet the level of communication is profound. And I've always found that fascinating to think about. And I feel like that's where the poetry is sometimes. It's in the words that you have not been able to say or write down, but somehow to suggest in the words that are there.
I was going to ask you about horses. Has anything replaced horseback riding for you?
I haven't looked for anything to replace it. I haven't needed that. I mean, I don't do any sports or anything. My wife and I live a pretty low-key, reclusive life here in the semi-arid portion of the Southwest. And I haven't sought a replacement for the horses. The horses really were all consuming for during my teenage years. It was kind of late in the game when I started thinking about riding as something that I would be spending much of my life doing.
Yeah, it was the horses first.
Horses first, yeah.
How do we, you know, as certainly as I get older, I can't do the things that I did when I was in my 20s. That's becoming increasingly evident to me. How do we mourn the physicality that we don't have anymore?
How do I mourn it?
Yeah, or not even you, but just we. How is it mourned? Is it mourned?
I don't find it mournful. I feel happy being able to do what things I can do, and I take pleasure in just ordinary life. Right now, it's a little harder to do. You know, we're all surrounded by various sensible restrictions. But one of the things that my wife and I like to do is to go downtown in Santa Fe and just walk around the block that we've not spent any time on any time lately. And we go into every single shop that we pass, even though from the outside it might appear that there's nothing in here for us. And it may turn out that way, but it's not dull, nevertheless.
That's great. Olivia?
So as we're like looking back on horses and your experience with them, makes me think of like how much of your poetry does have that looking back quality. So I was hoping you could read Breakings for us on page 145.
Uh-huh. I should say that there's a combine is a machine that simultaneously cuts and threshes grain. And in the days that this poem is looking back on, these machines were in a moderately early stage. They were pulled by a tractor. And instead of catching the grain in a gigantic bin the way they do now, there was somebody had to ride on the side of the machine, and there was a tube that came down the side of the machine and forked into two tubes with bag clamps on either end of it. And you had to sit there and put bags on the ends of these things and wait till they filled up, switch the thing over to the other empty bag, and take this bag and tie it and throw it onto a platform that you tilted every so often and dropped into the field. It was nasty, nasty work. The barley, for example, has little submicroscopic or nearly microscopic spines on it that get between your clothes and your skin and make you very, very, very uncomfortable. Breakings. Long before I first left home, my father tried to teach me horses, land, and sky to show me how his kind of work was done. I studied how to be my father's son, but all I learned was when the wicked die, they ride combines through barley forever. Every summer I hated my father as I drove hot horses through dusty grass, and so I broke with him and left the farm for other work, where unfamiliar weather broke on my head, an unexpected storm, and things I had not studied came to pass. So nothing changes, nothing stays the same, and I have returned from a broken home, alone, to ask for a job breaking horses. I watch a colt on a lunge line making tracks in dust, and think of the kinds of breakings there are, and the kinds of restraining forces.
Oh, thank you. So like I said, a lot of your poems have that sort of frozen in time quality. So I wanted to ask why you think you often find yourself looking back on these moments in like the past in rural Virginia.
I enjoy thinking about it. It's a period of time in my life that was very pleasurable most of the time for me. And I just have a good time thinking about it. As I said earlier, it doesn't always turn out that my thinking leads to writing something. But once in a while, it does. This poem was actually inspired by another poem called Breakings, by a man named Thomas Whitbread, who was a friend of mine for a long time. He's no longer living now. But he had this poem about the way different things break. And I thought, and yeah, I can do that too. And I can broaden the scope a little bit by talking about breaking horses, which doesn't mean that they're made into little pieces. And it was a poem that was okay with him, I'm happy to say.
Thank you. So as you said, you no longer live in Virginia, and this poem was written, it was in the collection between 1962 and 1965. So has your perspective changed as you look back on these moments now that you're farther away, both in time and space?
Well, maybe. I learned to like the West in the late 60s. I took a job when I left Roanoke College, where I taught for 2 years at Roanoke College, and then I took a job at the University of Utah and moved out there. I don't think I'd been west of the Mississippi at that point. And I found there were qualities to the Western landscape that appealed deeply to me. And there's also something about living at a higher altitude. I've gotten to a place in my life where that's not in always the best thing for me. I have a slight heart condition that causes shortness of breath sometimes. And it's easy to get short of breath at 7,200 feet. Salt Lake City is only 4,200 feet, but it was enough to notice for somebody who was moving there from nearly sea level. But I loved the feel of being in that atmosphere, the semi-arid, near desert, the quality. There's a kind of stripped down purity to it that interests me. So I feel like we've come to a place that we're not going to have to move from till we have to move from the earth.
Thank you. I think that ties in with Cameron's next question for the South and regions.
It does. I think, Henry, how are you feeling? I think we've got maybe one more poem to talk about. Okay. Which is My Dear Sister Hannah. This is a long poem, and you know, we don't have the time to get through the whole thing.
No, we don't.
If you could maybe start it on page 66, at the bottom, second day morning. Does that sound like a good place to begin?
And go to the end?
Yeah, and go to the end.
Okay, let me just say, just by setting this up, that this is a letter written in 1864 from a woman named Carrie Taylor, who lived in Purcellville, Virginia, to her sister Hannah Stabler, who lived over around Sandy Spring, Maryland. And there is such a letter. This poem is a versification of that letter. It bears heavily upon it. And the Quakers did not use names of the days of the week. So second day is Monday.
Yeah.
Second day morning. I am ashamed to write so bad a letter, but time is too scarce to write it over, and I might not do it better, for the subject makes me so nervous I can hardly write. Since I began this, another loss struck us seventh day night. I'm sorry, I'm going to start again. I'm going to say this is about a burning raid that was conducted in western Loudoun County in December of 1864 by some Union troops that were trying to destroy the provender that could be supplying Mosby's troops. Mosby was that guerrilla warfare guy that hung out in Fauquier and Loudoun counties. He would strike it in the middle of the night and make off with a colonel or something like that from a Union camp. And they wanted to deplete his supply sources. So they burned up barns and drove off livestock and stuff. And this woman is writing to her sister about how that happened. Second day morning, I am ashamed to write so bad a letter, but time is too scarce to write it over, and I might not do it better, for the subject makes me so nervous I can hardly write. Since I began this, another loss struck us seventh day night, when our good blind mare died suddenly. William had ridden her a day or two. She had the colic, he thinks. One thing is sure, he has lost his last horse, poor man. He is down to one colt now. One of our cows came home this morning, mine. Alice's pretty cow is gone. Whole flocks and herds are loose along the mountain road, and people are busily taking them up by stealth and force and fraud. We have hogs and would butcher tomorrow, but there is still the threat of soldiers returning, for we have heard they are not done with us yet. I despise the rebels more than ever for causing this awful mess. Some weak-minded people will perhaps be more illegible after this, but all I can say is they never had any unionism about them. True, these were Sheridan's orders and men, though we could have done without them. Alice thinks it would be nice to have a photograph of us around the officer pleading for the barn, but we looked so dolorous, I doubt we would gladly send it to you. William says ask Robert if there is an old blind horse about he could trade for a bare cupboard. I don't feel like starting over here, but if we went away, we would be beggars. Uncle Henry still has his barn today. Uncle Aquila's is not burned either, so close to the house they spared it. And Jonah Hatcher's is not. He bought them off, as I have heard it. I must close. How I wish to see thee. Alice has much to tell and would write, but is too near crazy. Do write us. Love to all. Sincerely, thy sister.
Thank you. I love the illegible. It's fantastic.
Thanks. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was gonna say that as a person who's been called a Southern writer and has been at various times, well, I was for a while a member of the Fellowship of Southern Writers. I'm still an inactive member. I need to remind people that I'm also a member of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers. And it's an interesting thing to have grown up being a Southern Quaker, because the values and attitudes of the Quakers are significantly at odds with many of the values and attitudes that built the rural South. The Quakers were abolitionists, and we're pacifists. So they didn't cheerfully take sides with anybody who was fighting, but they were more in sympathy with the Union position than they were with people defending slavery. So that explains some of the, I mean, this took place in Virginia. This burning was in Northern Virginia, but these people, Carrie Taylor, when she says they despise the rebels for causing all this, she's not kidding.
Yeah, this poem for me, it sort of coalesces, stuff that I see elsewhere, like the dining room at Springdale, where you talk about the glories of decline toward bed and breakfast. And I'm from Virginia. I'm from Loudoun County, actually. But
are you really?
I am. My Loudoun County is probably a little different than your Loudoun County. I was in there when it was becoming what it is now.
Yeah, population now in the neighborhood of 450,000.
It's a different place now.
Yeah.
But as such, this question of Southernness, it certainly it has to be addressed. But what is it and how is it to be addressed? How do you understand Southernness and how do you approach it when you write?
Well, I don't think about it as a part of the process or anything like that. I think about it from time to time because people do ask the kinds of questions that you're asking. And it is an interesting topic. Why is it, for example, that we single out Southern literature a little bit more sometimes? People are getting better about this, but it's more of an entity than New England literature. New England literature was really something in the 18th and 19th centuries, but people don't think about it that way anymore. And in fact, there are plenty of Southerners who don't bring to mind the South when you read their work. But there are qualities of Southernness that are different from certain other kinds of regional qualities. The sound of the slight accent or the deep accent, if you're trying to get ready to be in the Dukes of Hazzard. The bent for certain kinds of storytelling and certain ingredients of storytelling that I think of as peculiarly Southern. You read a poem by Robert Penn Warren and you find a very complicated mixture of deadly seriousness and lightheartedness and humor, and a self-conscious willingness to use unexpected words. There's a wonderful passage in a short poem. I mean, a short passage. It's a longer poem. It's called "Folly on Royal Street Before the Raw Face of God," is the name of the whole poem, and it runs 2 or 3 pages, and it's a recollection of 3 young men walking around in the French Quarter, New Orleans, in springtime, drunk out of their minds and reciting Milton. We mouthed out our Milton for magnificence. And then there comes this little passage. A cop of brachycephalic head and garlic breath, toothpick from side of mouth, pants ass bagged and holster low, from eyes the color of old coffee grounds, regarded with imperfect sympathy la condition humaine, which is sure God what we were. Now, I think that's typically Southern storytelling. And I think when a man says with a straight face that a cop had a brachycephalic head, and then goes a few lines down and refers to la condition humaine, I mean, and pants ass bagged and holster low, is somebody whose range is vast and likes to play the whole range. And you find that, I think, more often in Southern storytelling than you do in other places. So I think that may be one of the ingredients that I enjoy thinking about.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Olivia, do you have a question?
Yeah, so we talked about how this one poem, My Dear Sister Hannah, is one of the only poems about women. So I was curious if you could speak to that and why you feel like they don't appear in more of the poems.
Well, my wife appears in the dedication poem. And a woman who's referred to as my wife's mother, not my present wife's mother, appears in At the Swings. But I don't think of myself as somebody who thinks of women as an object or a topic in and of itself. Women turn up, but they, so do men. And so do horses.
We got one more question for you. You retired from teaching in 2003.
Yeah.
And has that affected the writing at all? What's the connection that you felt between the teaching and the writing?
Well, I think that there was a certain amount of that it was complicated, but there was a certain amount of encouragement to be had from working with student writing. On the other hand, as you doubtless know, the demands of on your time working with student writing are very considerable. And so when you're doing full-time teaching, you're not doing full-time writing. Most of us couldn't do full-time writing and survive. I mean, that's the economics of it. If we were the kind of people who had the kind of gift that, let us say, Arthur Haley had, then I'm blanking on a name. It's embarrassing because he's somebody that I respect and admire. He's the lawyer in Charlottesville. Writes bestsellers about
John Grisham.
Yeah. Grisham is a special case, in my opinion. I had a conversation with him once about serious literature and popular fiction. And he told me how he had sort of knocked himself out over his first novel, working away at it, taking himself as seriously as if he were Faulkner. And when he got it done, what he realized he had was a piece of popular fiction. He said, "This is what I am able to do. This is what I can do, and I can do it well." And I don't deceive myself about that. Now, Steve King, he thinks he contains literature, and he may. But that's a difference that is important in what we're talking about. If you can write like Grisham, then you can write full time. And and the other way to do it is to be somebody like James Merrill, who was born into enormous wealth. He wrote full time, except that about every 7 years he would take an anti-sabbatical and go somewhere and teach for a year. But ceasing to teach freed me up in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, I went through a period of something akin to depression, I guess, for a while. And I wrote virtually nothing for several years during the time that we lived in the Pacific Northwest. When we moved down here about 6 years, 5.5, 6 years ago, things began to open up again.
That's great. That's great. It's the sunshine.
Yeah. That's a big part of it.
Yeah. Well, Mr. Taylor, thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time.
you.
This
Yeah,
is
appreciate it.
really wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Olivia.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
both of your questions. Nice to be here.
Yes,
I should have worn my Roanoke College t-shirt, but it's a sweatshirt actually, and it's a little warm for it.
Well, I can't tell you how much I enjoyed just listening in and hearing all your wise words. I took some notes that I think will crop up in some of my own writing. So I'll try to remember to give credit where credit's due when it happens. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Really lovely.
Thanks a lot,
Lovely
Mary.
spending time with you and hearing your good words. All right, so I guess I'll, yep. Yeah.